Chapter 4. We are now arrived at that remarkable event of the present reign, the Partition of Poland, which was planned with such profound secrecy that it was scarcely suspected before it was carried into execution. Poland had long derived its principal security from its peculiar situation between three great powers, each equally interested to prevent the others from acquiring any increase of strength or addition of territory. The union of these rival potentates was considered as a circumstance nearly impossible, and should such an unexpected union take place, it was thought incredible that the other princes of Europe would passively submit to a material alteration in the balance of power. Treaties upon treaties, and negotiations upon negotiations, had guaranteed to Poland the possession of her territory, and the very three powers who dismembered her provinces had, at the present king's accession, solemnly renounced all right and title to any part of the Polish dominions. But treaties and guarantees are, in general, only adhered to until they can be broken with safety. The only effectual method for any state to secure its dominions is to make itself respectable by its strength and unanimity, and to be prepared against any attacks. When a powerful people impute national disasters, which proper vigor and foresight might have prevented, to the perfidy of foreign states, they only bear testimony in more specious terms to their own indolence, negligence, or weakness of government. Nor is that systematic jealousy, which modern nations profess to entertain for the balance of power, to be depended on as a more effectual safeguard to any particular state than the faith of treaties. This principle, though founded on the most obvious and judicious policy, and though at times productive of the most beneficial effects, is unluckily liable to be counteracted and defeated by an almost innumerable variety of contingencies. Where a combination of different powers is requisite to give it efficacy, those powers may want unanimity and concert. Where again, the exertion of only a single state is sufficient, that state may, by the temporary situation of affairs or the casual interests of its governing party, be rendered incapable of acting with proper spirit. In a word, the anxiety of European states for the preservation of the balance of power is by no means an invariable pledge of protection to any single nation. Venice was brought to the verge of ruin by reliance on this principle. Poland received from it no substantial protection, nor did England, though struggling singly against a host of enemies, reap, in her late contest, the slightest benefit from its influence. The natural strength of Poland, if properly exerted, would have formed a more certain bulwark against the ambition of her neighbours than the faith of treaties or attention in the other European nations to the balance of power. And it is extremely worthy of remark that of the three partitioning powers, Prussia was formerly in a state of vassalage to the Republic. Russia once saw its capital and throne possessed by the Poles, and Austria, scarce a century ago, was indebted to a sovereign of this country for the preservation of its metropolis, and almost for its very existence. A kingdom so lately, the master or protector of its neighbours, would never have been so readily overwhelmed by them had there not been the most glaring imperfections in its government. Poland, in truth, was formerly more powerful than any of the surrounding states, but, due to the defects of its constitution, declined in the midst of general improvements. After once giving law to the north, it has now become an easy prey to every invader. The partition of Poland was first projected by the King of Prussia. Polish or Western Prussia had long been an object of his ambition. Exclusive of its fertility, commerce, and population, its local situation rendered it highly valuable to that monarch. It lay between his German dominions and Eastern Prussia. While possessed by the Poles, it cut off at their will all communication between them. During the course of the last general war, he experienced the most fatal effects from this disjointed state of his territories. By the acquisition of Western Prussia, his dominions would be rendered compact, and his troops in time of war would be able to march from Berlin to Königsberg without interruption. The period was now arrived when the situation of Poland seemed to promise the attainment of this favorable object. He pursued it, however, with all the caution of an able politician. On the commencement of the troubles, he showed no eagerness to interfere in the affairs of this country, and although he had concurred with the Empress of Russia in raising Stanislaus Augustus to the throne of Poland, yet he declined taking any active part in his favor against the Confederates. Afterwards, in 1769, when the whole kingdom became convulsed throughout with civil commotions, and was likewise desolated by the plague, he, under the pretense of forming lines to prevent the spreading of the infection, advanced his troops into Polish Prussia and occupied that whole district. Though now completely master of the country, and by no means apprehensive of any formidable resistance from the disunited and distracted Poles, yet, as he was well aware that the security of his new acquisition depended upon the acquiescence of Russia and Austria, he planned the partition of Poland. He communicated the project to the emperor, either during their interview at Neiße in Silesia in 1769, or in that of the following year at Neustadt, from whom the overture met with a ready concurrence. Joseph, who had before secretly encouraged the Confederates and even commenced a negotiation with the Porte against Russia, now suddenly altered his measures and increased his army towards the Polish frontiers. The plague, presenting to him as well as to the King of Prussia a specious motive for stationing troops in the dominions of the Republic, allowed him to gradually extend his lines, and in 1772 he occupied the whole territory, which he has since dismembered. But notwithstanding this change in his sentiments, his real views upon Poland were at first so effectually concealed that the Polish rebels conceived that the Austrian army was advancing to act in their favor, not supposing it possible that the rival courts of Vienna and Berlin could act in concert. Nothing more remained towards completing the partition than the accession of the Empress of Russia. That great princess was too discerning a politician not to regard with a jealous eye the introduction of foreign powers into Poland. Possessing an uncontrolled ascendancy over the whole country, she, Russia, could propose no material advantage from the formal acquisition of a part, and must purchase a moderate addition to her territory by a considerable surrender of authority. The King of Prussia, well acquainted with the true interests of Russia in regard to Poland, and with the capacity of the Empress to discern those interests, forbore, it is said, from opening any negotiation on the subject of the partition until she was involved in a Turkish war. At that crisis, he dispatched his brother, Prince Henry, to Petersburg, who suggested to the Empress that the House of Austria was forming an alliance with the Porte, which, if it took place, would create a most formidable combination against her. Nevertheless, the friendship of that house was to be purchased by acceding to the partition, that upon this condition the Emperor was willing to renounce his connection with the Grand Signor and would suffer the Russians to prosecute the war without interruption. Catherine, anxious to push her conquests against the Turks, and dreading the interposition of the Emperor in that quarter, perceived likewise from the intimate union between the courts of Vienna and Berlin that it would not be in her power, at the present juncture, to prevent the intended partition. She closed with the proposal and selected no inconsiderable portion of the Polish territories for herself. The treaty was signed at Petersburg in the beginning of February 1772 by the Russian, Austrian, and Prussian plenipotentiaries. As the troops of the three courts were already in possession of the greatest part of Poland, the Confederates, hemmed in on all sides, were soon routed and dispersed. Europe waited in anxious expectation of what would be the issue of this unexpected union. Yet such was the profound secrecy with which the partitioning powers proceeded, that for some time after the ratification of the treaty, only vague conjectures were entertained, even at Warsaw, concerning their real intentions. And the late Lord Cathcart, the English minister at Petersburg, was able to obtain no authentic information of its signature until 2 months after the event. The first formal notification of any pretensions to the Polish territory was in the month of September 1772, announced to the King and Senate assembled at Warsaw by the imperial ambassador. This was soon followed by the memorials of the Russian and Prussian courts, specifying their respective claims. It would be tedious to enter into a detail of the pleas urged by the three powers in favor of their several demands. It would be no less uninteresting to lay before the reader the answers and remonstrances of the King and Senate, as well as the appeals to the other states which had guaranteed the possessions of Poland. The courts of London, Paris, Stockholm and Copenhagen remonstrated against the usurpations, but remonstrances without assistance could be of no effect. Poland submitted to the dismemberment, not without the most violent struggles, and now, for the first time, felt and lamented the fatal effects of faction and discord. Our Diet being demanded by the partitioning powers in order to ratify the cession of the provinces was, after some delay, convoked by the King in the following summons. Since there are no hopes from any quarter, and any further delays will only tend to draw down the most dreadful calamities upon the remainder of the dominions which are left to the Republic, the Diet is convened for the 19th of April, 1773, according to the will of the three courts. Nevertheless, in order to avoid all cause of reproach, the King, with the advice of the Senate, again appeals to the guarantees of the Treaty of Oliva. The Diet met at the appointed time, and such was the spirit of the members that, notwithstanding the deplorable situation of their country, the threats and bribes of the three powers ensured that the partition treaty was not carried through without much difficulty. For some time, the majority of the nuncios appeared determined to oppose the dismemberment, and the King firmly persisted in the same resolution. The ambassadors of the three courts enforced their requisitions by the most alarming menaces, and threatened the King with deposition and imprisonment. They also spread rumors through their emissaries that, if the Diet continued to be refractory, Warsaw should be pillaged. This report was industriously circulated and made a strong impression upon the inhabitants. By menaces of this sort, by corrupting the Marshal of the Diet, who was accompanied by a Russian guard, in a word, by bribes, promises and threats, the members of the Diet were at length prevailed upon to ratify the dismemberment. In the Senate, however, or upper house, there was a majority of only 6. In the lower house, or assembly of the nuncios, of but one single vote in favor of the measure. An act was then passed to limit the sessions to the term of a few days, and delegates were appointed with full powers to adjust, in concert with the ambassadors, all the terms of the dismemberment. The commissioners or delegates, upon the breaking up of the Diet in May, immediately entered upon their offices, and by the month of September finally concluded the Treaty of Partition in conformity to the dictates of the three courts. At this juncture, several nobles were bold enough to issue manifestos and remonstrances in various parts of the kingdom against the cession of the provinces and to reprobate the conduct of the partitioning powers. However, such remonstrances were totally disregarded and may be considered only as the last convulsions of an expiring nation. Of the dismembered countries, the Russian province was the largest, the Austrian the most populous, and the Prussian the most commercial. The total population of the annexed territories amounted to nearly 5,000 souls, the first containing 1,500,000, the second 2,500,000, and the third 860,000. Western Prussia was the greatest loss to Poland, as by the dismemberment of that province was that the navigation of the Vistula became entirely dependent upon the King of Prussia. The loss of this district dealt a fatal blow to Polish trade, for His Prussian Majesty imposed such heavy duties upon merchandise passing to Danzig as to greatly diminish the commerce of that town and to transfer a considerable portion of it to Memel and Königsberg. Although the limits of Poland were settled by the Treaty of Partition, the Austrians and Prussians continually extended their frontiers. The Emperor seized upon Casimir and even avowed an intention of taking possession of Krakow and Kamianets. Meanwhile, Frederick alleged these usurpations as justification for similar encroachments on his part, arguing that he could not, consistent with his own security, see the Emperor increasing his dominions without following his example and assuming an equivalent. Catherine was forced for a time to connive at these encroachments, but no sooner was peace established with the Turks and the rebellion of Pugachev crushed than she immediately turned her whole attention to Poland. It was due to her spirited remonstrances that both Austrians and Prussians relinquished their usurpations and confined themselves to the limits marked by the Treaty of Partition. The partitioning powers did less injury to the Republic by dismembering its fairest provinces than by perpetuating the principles of anarchy and confusion and establishing on a permanent footing that exorbitant liberty which is the parent of faction has proved the decline of the Republic. Under pretense of amending the Constitution, they have confirmed all its defects and have taken effectual precautions to render this unhappy country incapable of emerging from its present deplorable state. The delegates who ratified the Treaty of Partition, being also empowered by the Diet to concert with the three courts any alterations in the Constitution which might appear beneficial to the kingdom, continued sitting from May 1773 to March 1775. During this period, the convocation of the ordinary Diet was postponed until the members of the delegation had agreed to all the innovations proposed by the ambassadors and until every part of the government was finally arranged. Notwithstanding the wretched condition of Poland and the resistless power of the three courts, the king and the majority of the delegates long withheld their consent to the proposed alterations. Some idea of their spirit may be formed from the following account of one of the meetings, when the propositions relating to the change of government were first produced in September 1773. Prior to the appearance of the three ambassadors in the assembly, much was said, and with great vehemence against the projected innovations. Many reproaches were thrown out against the authors of that plan for sacrificing the public advantage to their private ambition, resentment, and interests. At the entrance of the three ambassadors, a profound silence took place for some minutes, until the secretary of the Russian embassy began to read the plan for remodeling the Constitution. Upon this, a general murmur spread through the whole assembly, increasing as he proceeded to such a degree as almost to drown his voice. Nor was it without frequent interruptions that he was permitted to finish its recital. He had scarcely concluded when the whole body of delegates loudly demanded the treaties of partition and alliance. The ambassadors answered that many points could not be adjusted without further instructions from their respective courts. It was then replied that in the meantime they might introduce the Treaty of Commerce, which they were authorized to conclude. At all events, it was urged that the proposal concerning the change of government was premature. A revolution of such extreme importance demanded the most deliberate examination and ought not to be hurried through as if it were a circumstance of no concern to the nation. One of the delegates, who was most violent in his opposition, delivered his sentiments with a freedom that astonished the assembly. When the ambassadors, who did not understand the Polish idiom, applied to a Castellan for an explanation of what was said, the latter excused himself under the pretense of not being qualified for the office of interpreter, as he had only an imperfect knowledge of the French language. When at last one of the Palatines, who was of the ambassadors' party, acquainted them with the contents of the speech, the orator then ventured to thank him for explaining the purport of his harangue in so able a manner, while the praises that, in a fine tone of irony, he affected to bestow upon the Palatine for his readiness to oblige, as well as for his independent spirit, occasioned much mirth in the assembly. The undisguised approbation given by the greatest part of the members to this orator convinced the ambassadors that this was no time to obtrude their resolutions upon the delegates. They accordingly broke up the meeting and postponed the business to a future opportunity. The next session, however, was not more favorable to their wishes, nor did the patriotic zeal of the delegates seem to abate. Their opposition to this measure continued so violent that more than a year elapsed before the ambassadors were able, by the influence of threats, bribery, and promises, to obtain a majority, and before the delegates, terrified or seduced into compliance, formally acceded to the change of government. This important point being obtained, the delegation was dissolved on the 13th of April 1775, and all the articles were confirmed by the General Diet. The following note, delivered by the 3 ambassadors to the delegates on September 13, 1773, gives the best general idea of the changes made in the constitution. The courts are so interested in the pacification of Poland that while the treaties are getting ready to be signed and ratified, the ministers cannot lose any of that valuable time so necessary for the re-establishment of order and the tranquility of this kingdom. We now therefore deliver to the delegation a part of those cardinal laws, to the ratification of which our courts will not suffer any contradiction. 1. The crown of Poland shall be forever elective, and all order of succession prescribed. Any person who shall endeavor to break this law shall be declared an enemy to his country and liable to be punished accordingly. 2. Foreign candidates to the throne, being the frequent cause of troubles and division, shall be excluded, and it shall be enacted that for the future no person can be chosen King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania, excepting a native Pole of noble origin and possessing land within the kingdom. The son or grandson of a King of Poland cannot be elected immediately upon the death of their father or grandfather, nor shall they be eligible until after an interval of 2 reigns. 3. The government of Poland shall be forever free, independent, and of a republican form. 4. The true principle of the said government consists in the strict execution of its laws and the equilibrium of the 3 estates, namely, the king, the senate, and the equestrian order. A permanent council shall be established, in which the executive power shall be vested. In this council, the equestrian order, hitherto excluded from the administration of affairs in the intervals of the diets, shall be admitted, as shall be more clearly laid down in future arrangements. These arrangements having been carried into execution, I shall make a few remarks upon the several articles. By the first, the House of Saxony and all foreign princes, who might be likely to give weight to Poland by their hereditary dominions, are rendered incapable of filling the throne. By the second, the exclusion of a king's son or grandson, excepting after an interval of 2 reigns, removes the faintest prospect of an hereditary sovereignty, entails upon the kingdom all the evils inseparable from that most wretched form of government, an elective monarchy. By the third article, the liberum veto and all the exorbitant privileges of the equestrian order are confirmed in their utmost latitude. By the last, the prerogatives of the crown, which were already too greatly reduced, are still further diminished, as will more particularly appear in the ensuing chapter. Before the conclusion of this chapter, it will be proper to mention the fate of the dissidents. Their pretensions were finally settled between the Republic and the mediating powers at the last meeting of the delegates. The Catholic party opposed in so violent a manner the restoration of their ancient privileges that by the consent of the foreign courts they continue excluded from the Diet, the Senate, and the Permanent Council. In return, however, the dissidents enjoy the free exercise of their religion. They are permitted to have churches without bells, schools, and seminaries of their own. They are capable of sitting in the inferior courts of justice and in the tribunal, appointed to receive appeals in matters of religion. 3 of their communion are admitted as assessors. In consequence of this toleration, the dissidents have constructed churches in different parts of the kingdom. One built upon this occasion by the Lutherans at Warsaw bears the following inscription: "These buildings were consecrated to God the Almighty." The Warsaw Assembly of the Augustan Confession, with the consent of King Stanislaus Augustus and the Republic, began their construction on April 24, 1777,